A noise drew her attention in the drawing-room window, the squeak of a hinge. The light breeze was toying with the window. There must have been people who disliked her very much, Lily thought. Yes, she realized that the drawing-room step was empty. But it had no effect on her whatever. She did not want Mrs. Ramsay now. People who thought her too short, too drastic. Also, her beauty offended people probably. How monotonous, they would say, and the same always. They preferred another type, the dark, the vivacious. Then she was weak with her husband. She let him make those scenes. Then she was reserved. Nobody knew exactly what had happened to her. And to go back to Mr. Carmichael and his dislike, one could not imagine Mrs. Ramsay standing painting, lying reading a whole morning on the lawn. It was unthinkable. Without saying a word, the only token of her errand, a basket on her arm, she went off to the town, to the poor, to sit in some stuffy little bedroom. Often and often Lily had seen her go silently in the midst of some game, some discussion, with her basket on her arm, very upright. She had noted her return. She had thought, half laughing, she was so methodical with the teacups. Half moved, her beauty took one's breath away. Eyes that are closing in pain have looked on you. Yeah, I've been with them there. And then Mrs. Ramsay would be annoyed because somebody was late, or the butter not fresh, or the teapot chipped. And all the time she was saying that the butter was not fresh, one would be thinking of Greek temples and how beauty had been with them there in that stuffy little room. She never talked of it. She went punctually, directly. It was her instinct to go, an instinct like the swallows for the south, the artichokes for the sun, turning her infallibly to the human race, making her nest in its heart. And this, like all instincts, was a little distressing to people who did not share it. To Mr. Carmichael, perhaps, to herself, certainly, some notion was in both of them about the ineffectiveness of action, the supremacy of thought. Her going was a reproach to them, gave a different twist to the world, so that they were led to protest, seeing their own prepossessions disappear and clutch at them vanishing. Charles Tansley did that too. It was part of the reason why one disliked him. He upset the proportions of one's world. And what had happened to him, she wondered, idly stirring the plantains with her brush. He had got his fellowship, he had married, he lived at Golders Green. She had gone one day into a hall and heard him speaking during the war. He was denouncing something, he was condemning somebody. He was preaching brotherly love, and all she felt was how could he love his kind who did not know one picture from another, who had stood before her smoking shag, 5 pence an ounce, Miss Briscoe, and making it his business to tell her women can't write, women can't paint, not so much that he believed it, as that for some odd reason he wished it. There he was, lean and red and raucous, preaching love from a platform. There were ants crawling about among the plantains, which she disturbed with her brush, red, energetic, shiny ants, rather like Charles Tansley. She had looked at him ironically from her seat in the half-empty hall, pumping love into that chilly space, and suddenly there was the old cask or whatever it was bobbing up and down among the waves, and Mrs. Ramsay looking for her spectacle case among the pebbles. Oh dear, what a nuisance. Lost again. Don't bother, Mr. Tansley. I lose thousands every summer. At which he pressed his chin back against his collar as if afraid to sanction some exaggeration, but could stand it in her whom he liked and smiled very charmingly. He must have confided in her on one of those long expeditions when people got separated and walked back alone. He was educating his little sister, Mrs. Ramsay had told her. It was immensely to his credit. Her own idea of him was grotesque, Lily knew well, stirring the plantains with her brush. Half one's notions of other people were, after all, grotesque. They served private purposes of one's own. He did for her instead of a whipping boy. She found herself flagellating his lean flanks when she was out of temper. If she wanted to be serious about him, she had to help herself to Mrs. Ramsay's sayings, to look at him through her eyes. She raised a little mountain for the ants to climb over. She reduced them to a frenzy of indecision by this interference in their cosmogony. Some ran this way, others that. One wanted 50 pairs of eyes to see with, she reflected. 50 pairs of eyes were not enough to get round that one woman with, she thought. Among them must be one that was stone blind to her beauty. One wanted some secret sense, fine as air, with which to steal through keyholes and surround her where she sat knitting, talking, sitting silent in the window alone. which took to itself and treasured up like the air which held the smoke of the steamer, her thoughts, her imaginations, her desires. What did the hedge mean to her? What did the garden mean to her? What did it mean to her when a wave broke? Lily looked up. As she had seen Mrs. Ramsay look up, she too heard a wave falling on the beach. And then what stirred and trembled in her mind when the children cried, "How's that? How's that?" cricketing. She would stop knitting for a second. She would look intent. Then she would lapse again. Suddenly Mr. Ramsay stopped dead in his pacing in front of her, and some curious shock passed through her and seemed to rock her in profound agitation on its breast. When stopping there, he stood over her and looked down at her. Lily could see him. He stretched out his hand and raised her from her chair. It seemed somehow as if he had done it before, as if he had once bent in the same way and raised her from a boat which, lying a few inches off some island, had required that the ladies should thus be helped on shore by the gentlemen. An old-fashioned scene that was, which required very nearly crinolines and peg-top trousers. Letting herself be helped by him, Mrs. Ramsay had thought, Lily supposed, the time has come now. Yes, she would say it now. Yes, she would marry him. And she stepped slowly, quietly on shore. Probably she said one word only, letting her hand rest still in his. "I will marry you," she might have said, with her hand in his, but no more. Time after time, the same thrill had passed between them. Obviously it had, Lily thought, smoothing away for her aunt. She was not inventing. She was only trying to smooth out something she had been given years ago, folded up. Something she had seen, for in the rough and tumble of daily life with all those children about, all those visitors, one had constantly a sense of repetition, of one thing falling where another had fallen, and so setting up an echo which chimed in the air and made it full of vibrations. But it would be a mistake, she thought, thinking how they walked off together arm in arm past the greenhouse to simplify their relationship. It was no monotony of bliss. She with her impulses and quicknesses, he with his shudders and glooms. Oh no! The bedroom door would slam violently early in the morning. He would start from the table in a temper. He would whiz his plate through the window. Then all through the house there would be a sense of doors slamming and blinds fluttering, as if a gusty wind were blowing and people scudded about, trying in a hasty way to fasten hatches and make things ship-shape. She had met Paul Rayleigh like that one day on the stairs. It had been an earwig, apparently. Other people might find centipedes. They had laughed and laughed. But it tired Mrs. Ramsay. It cowed her a little, the plates whizzing and the doors slamming, and there would fall between them sometimes long, rigid silences when, in a state of mind which annoyed Lily and her, half plaintive, half resentful, she seemed unable to surmount the tempest calmly, or to laugh as they laughed, but in her weariness perhaps concealed something. She brooded and sat silent. After a time he would hang stealthily about the places where she was, roaming under the window where she sat writing letters or talking, for she would take care to be busy when he passed, and evade him, and pretend not to see him. Then he would turn smooth as silk, affable, urbane, and try to win her so. Still she would hold off, and now she would assert for a brief season some of those prides and airs, the due of her beauty, which she was generally utterly without, would turn her head, would look so, over her shoulder, always with some Minta, Paul, or William Banks at her side. At length, standing outside the group, the very figure of a famished wolfhound, Lily got up off the grass and stood looking at the steps at the window where she had seen him. He would say her name once only, for all the world like a wolf barking in the snow, but still she held back, and he would say it once more, and this time something in the tone would rouse her. And she would go to him, leaving them all of a sudden, and they would walk off together among the pear trees, the cabbages, and the raspberry beds. They would have it out together, but with what attitudes and with what words! Such a dignity was theirs in this relationship that, turning away, she and Paul and Minta would hide their curiosity and their discomfort and begin picking flowers, throwing balls, chattering until it was time for dinner. And there they were, he at one end of the table, she at the other, as usual. "Why don't some of you take up botany? With all those legs and arms, why doesn't one of you?" So they would talk as usual, laughing among the children. All would be as usual, save only for some quiver as of a blade in the air, which came and went between them, as if the usual sight of the children sitting round their soup plates had freshened itself in their eyes after that hour among the pears and the cabbages. Especially, Lily thought, Mrs. Ramsay would glance at Prue. She sat in the middle between brothers and sisters, always occupied, it seemed, seeing that nothing went wrong, so that she scarcely spoke herself. How Prue must have blamed herself for that earwig in the milk. How white she had gone when Mr. Ramsay threw his plate through the window. How she dropped under those long silences between them. Anyhow, her mother now would seem to be making it up to her, assuring her that everything was well, promising her that one of these days that same happiness would be hers. She had enjoyed it for less than a year, however. She had let the flowers fall from her basket, Lily thought, screwing up her eyes and standing back as if to look at her picture, which she was not touching, however, with all her faculties in a trance, frozen over superficially but moving underneath with extreme speed. She let her flowers fall from her basket, scattered and tumbled them on the grass, and reluctantly and hesitatingly, but without question or complaint, had she not the faculty of obedience to perfection, went too, down fields, across valleys, white, flower-strewn. That was how she would have painted it. The hills were austere, it was rocky, it was steep, the waves sounded hoarse on the stones beneath. They went, the three of them together, Mrs. Ramsay walking rather fast in front, as if she expected to meet someone round the corner. Suddenly the window at which she was looking was whitened by some light stuff behind it. At last, then, somebody had come into the drawing room. Somebody was sitting in the chair. For heaven's sake, she prayed, let them sit still there and not come floundering out to talk to her. Mercifully, whoever it was stayed still inside, held settled by some stroke of luck so as to throw an odd-shaped triangular shadow over the step. It altered the composition of the picture a little. It was interesting. It might be useful. Her mood was coming back to her. One must keep on looking without for a second relaxing the intensity of emotion. The determination not to be put off, not to be bamboozled. One must hold the scene. So, in a vice and let nothing come in and spoil it, one wanted, she thought, dipping her brush deliberately to be on a level with ordinary experience, to feel simply that's a chair, that's a table, and yet at the same time it's a miracle, it's an ecstasy. The problem might be solved after all. But what had happened? Some wave of white went over the window pane. The air must have stirred some flounce in the room. Her heart leapt at her and seized her and tortured her. Mrs. Ramsay, she cried, feeling the old horror come back to want and not to have. Could she inflict that still? And then quietly, as if she refrained, that too became part of ordinary experience. It was on a level with the chair, with the table. Mrs. Ramsay, it was part of her perfect goodness, sat there quite simply, in the chair, flicked her needles to and fro, knitted her reddish-brown stocking, cast her shadow on the step. There she sat. And as if she had something she must share, yet could hardly leave her easel, so full her mind was of what she was thinking, of what she was seeing, Lily went past Mr. Carmichael, holding her brush to the edge of the lawn. Where was that boat now? And Mr. Ramsay? She wanted him.